I'm going to spare you my introductions of the editors and the boss, Mark Ashurst McGee. They tell me he's the boss. Was it Master? What did they call you? I can't remember.
Master McGee.
They call me Mark.
Oh, Mark. Master Man. Is that what it was? He's going to introduce each of the editors and tell you the speaking order. But I just found out that despite the nature of the book and all of the work that's gone into it, with all those parts coming together, they came together tonight, and this is the first time that all 5 editors have been together at the same time. Isn't that funny? I think that's great. So, so that's cause for celebration in and of itself. So tonight, and Mark will introduce them, but the editors, Mark Ashurst McGee, David Grua, Elizabeth Keene, Alexander Baugh, and Brendan Rensink. They all have wonderful credentials that he can choose to go over or not. But we are very pleased to have them all with us tonight to not only to talk to us and tell us about this new volume, but to sign them. And you know, we've spoiled our customers so badly, they don't want to buy these books unless they're signed. So but I was going to say, and I've said this at some of the other papers get-togethers that we've had, but compared to other established papers projects like Washington, Lincoln, others, not Lincoln, but Franklin, sorry. You know, they're lucky to do up to 1,000 sets. And I was just checking again with Mark, and you remember the very first volume that came out, which was Journals.
Journals Volume 1.
Journals 1. 70,000 copies, which is just, it's just unbelievable. And it's been less since, considerably, but these sell in the thousands, not the hundreds. And I think it's a real tribute to the quality and the scholarship of all of these editors, all of these people that bring it all together. And you've heard me say before that I think the Joseph Smith Papers Project is one of the most significant, you can't call it an event, but an ongoing project that has had an enormous influence on the direction of Mormon history, and has opened so many other doors that I don't think most church members have any idea about. But it's a new level of scholarship and quality that doesn't mean that we didn't have quality in the past, but it's a new generation of scholars that are contributing, and to me it's exciting to see so many young people, including Alex, that are giving us the benefit of their minds and their spirits as well. And it's something that I've never seen in my entire 40-some years of book selling until this project started. So I'm excited about it. I'm excited for it to keep going, and I hope I'm around until the last volume is done. So with that, I will give you Mark Ashurst McGee.
Thanks, Kurt. That was a really nice introduction. I think that the success of the Joseph Smith Papers is also comes from the fact that in the church culture, we are very serious about our history. We care deeply about our history, and we have so many members who like to read Mormon history, and then we have people like yourselves who love Mormon history and buy books and read them, and we consider this like the perfect audience. And let's see, yeah, I'm really grateful that now that Alex is sitting in the crowd, we have more people in the audience than. We have, I know Kurt has, they have their newsletter letting you know about new stuff. The JSP has a newsletter that comes out every other month or so that will give you updates. If you want to sign up for that, I'm just going to place that right there. So I'm going to introduce the volume generally, really briefly, and then just talk a little bit about the first few months of the volume. Documents Volume 6 covers from February of 1838 to August of 1839. So the document opens in February of 1838 with Joseph Smith on the run from Kirtland to Far West. And he gets to Far West and throws himself into the work of developing and building up Far West. Starts expanding outside of Far West and outside of Caldwell County. And this expansion causes conflict, and pretty soon you've got an outbreak of violence with the Saints being expelled from DeWitt. You've got the preemptive strike on the anti-Mormons that are gathering to attack Adamant-Diamond. You've got the Crooked River Battle. You've got the Huntsville Massacre. You've got the siege and fall of Far West. You've got the arrest and incarceration of Joseph Smith, the occupation of Mormon lands, the seizure of Mormon property, extermination order, the Saints being evacuated, refugee situation in Illinois. This volume is just like non-stop, action-packed, amazing time in Mormon history. A very, very difficult time for Joseph Smith, who gets thrown in the dungeon of the Clay County Jail in Liberty. For the Latter-day Saints, who lose almost everything and get pushed out of the state, which is almost basically unheard of for white folks in America, not for Indians, but for white folks. So it's a really amazing volume. And then at the end of the volume, Joseph Smith rejoins the Saints and regroups in Quincy. They purchase the land on the Commerce Peninsula and start laying the foundations of Nauvoo. So it's just an amazing volume overall. And we're going to split it up chronologically. That was the super fast flyover from 10,000 feet. And each of us is going to take a little piece of that going forward. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the early months of the volume. So when Joseph Smith gets to Far West, like I said, he really throws himself into building up and developing Far West, and that is very adequately documented in meeting minutes, in letters, correspondence, in revelations. As you probably know, in 1829, 30, 31, 32, there's a lot of revelations. Almost, the better half of the revelations in the D&C come from that early period. And then there's kind of, really, comparatively, a lull in revelations. But in this period, in 1838, you really get a burst of revelations. So we have about a dozen in Documents Volume 6. One of the main revelations is the revelation of 1838, April 26, which calls Far West a holy place and commands the saints to build it up as a city of Zion with a temple. And that revelation ends by saying that Joseph Smith can designate further areas for settlement. And so they start pushing out, and you have the Adamant-Diamond settlement. We have one of our documents is the minutes of the organization of the Adamant-Diamond stake. And at the same time, they're starting to direct Mormon migration to DeWitt in Carroll County. And one of our documents is the correspondence with what are the landowners in Carroll County that they're trying to arrange land purchases with. So we have really good documentation of this really kind of energetic summer of 1838, spring, summer, and fall, where they're really building up Far West and surrounding areas as the central gathering place of the church, because Kirtland has kind of been abandoned. Then you start feeling the social tension, okay? And rewinding back to 1831, when William W. Phelps moved to Jackson County, he wrote a letter back to the Ontario Phoenix in New York, and he said, the Southerners of Missouri had, quote, customs, manners, modes of living, and a climate entirely different from Northerners, and they hate Yankees worse than snakes. So there's a north-south regional background, cultural difference between the Saints and their neighbors in Missouri. There's also kind of an east-west dynamic going on, because Missouri is in northwestern Missouri is the far western frontier of the organized United States. I mean, the Saints are the newest people from the east. A lot of these Missourians had lived in Kentucky, what's now West Virginia. So there's an east-west regional difference there, and of course it's not just regional differences, but a very significant religious difference as well between these people. And this is an era of growing social conflict in the United States that's well documented. And this kind of social conflict, especially the North-South divide, is going to culminate in America's Civil War eventually. So this volume also kind of sheds some light on social dynamics in the antebellum era. And I'm now going to introduce my co-editors. David Gruen, Elizabeth Keene, and myself are historians from the Church History Department. And Brendan Rensink and Alex Baugh are history professors from Brigham Young University. Alex is going to talk about the Mormon War in Missouri. David is going to talk about the Missouri, the jail experience of Joseph Smith. And then Brendan is going to talk about Quincy, and Elizabeth will talk about commerce.
Are you done, Mark?
I'm done.
Okay. Didn't know how far he'd go with Far West exactly, but hey, good to be here. As Mark mentioned, he'd like me to cover, actually it's these documents beginning in what is part 2 of the book, and that covers from the 8th of July, 1838 to October 29th. So about 4 months.
Your name?
I'm sorry, I'm Alex Baugh.
Okay.
So in this section, there's 24 documents, and they could be grouped into the following categories. First, there's 5 revelations. They're all given on the same day. I'll come back to that. Very interesting. Then there's 5 letters, 2 written by Joseph Smith and 3 addressed to him. There's 2 discourses. Now, in the Nauvoo volumes, they're going to get a lot more discourses. Joseph's starting to speak a lot more. The interesting thing about these 2 discourses is the inclusion is, you might think it was like from a minutes of a meeting or something like that, but this is actually William Swartzel's taking down of the notes that he heard Joseph Smith, as he heard Joseph Smith speak. And he's a short-lived Mormon. He comes from Ohio and goes up to Adimondayaman and becomes disenchanted, and he's gone. But he's there when Joseph is speaking, and there's 2 discourses there. We have the newspaper announcement that the church has printed the Sidney Rigdon's July 4th discourse. There's minutes of a meeting, and this kind of ties in with one of the revelations because Joseph's going to give, or the minutes describe how the disposition of tithes will be distributed and allocated and so on. It's kind of interesting. There's 4 business-related documents. One's a pay order of Joseph Smith, 2 receipts, and an account statement for services due to Joseph Smith's Ohio attorneys. There's 4 legal documents. I'm guessing they'll be part of the legal volume as well. One's a certificate of stolen goods returned to Joseph Smith. This was by Sylvester Hewlett. He apparently stole some of Joseph's stuff, and he got it back. There's a recognizance. This is the agreement Joseph Smith and Lyman White make that they will appear in court for this. I'm going to talk about it in just a second. And then these 2 affidavits. There's also 2 land records. One's a deed and one's a land patent signed by Martin Van Buren. Or scratched out. I think it was scratched out. It might be Martin Van Buren Jr. or something.
Junior.
Yeah, it might be
Junior
Junior.
Sainsbury's,
So anyway, but that one came later. It's kind of an interesting connection. Well, it was during this period, and more particularly the months of August through October, that the events associated with the Missouri Mormon War took place. And in researching the Mormon War, I've divided the conflict into 8 conflicts or episodes or engagements, which include the following. The Election Day skirmish, I just like to call it a skirmish rather than a battle, at Gallatin on August 8th. This marks really what we think is what we kind of classify as the beginning of the conflict. Then this one's a little more, less defined, but it's what I call the mid-August through September Mormon defense of Daviess County regulators, including the intercession made by the regional state militia under the leadership of David Rice Atchison and Alexander W. Donovan. So again, this kind of is a little more extensive. And then we have the Mormon defense of the LDS population living in DeWitt. That's the 3rd one down in Carroll County. And the Mormons go against regulators and vigilantes. And then the militia responds through the influence of Hiram G. Parks. Then we have the burning of Millport, Gallatin, and Grindstone Fork region by Mormon militia from Caldwell and Daviess County, followed by the wholesale expulsion of the non-Mormon residents by Mormon defenders. And that's basically about October 18th and kind of going through the next week. Then we have the famous encounter of Caldwell militia against the Ray County militia at Crooked River on October 24th, 25th. And the attack made by vigilantes, this is the sixth one, the attack made by vigilantes from Livingston and Daviess County against the Mormon settlement at Haun's Mill on October 30th. Then we have the final defense of Far West by the Mormons against the Missouri State Militia and vigilante forces. And then finally, the last one, which is kind of, again, just kind of the wrap-up, the Mormons surrender to Missouri State Militia at Far West on October 31st through the 5th of November. And then by November 9th, the citizens, Mormons up in Adam-on-the-Ammon surrender as well. What's interesting, significantly, most of the documents then in Doc 6 during this period are not connected with the Mormon-Missouri conflict. In fact, of the 24 documents, only 5 pertain to the Mormon War. And the question is, why have we only got so few? And the answer is, Joseph Smith's so busy. I mean, this conflict, he's not being able to record very well in terms of other documents. Now, George W. Robinson's keeping his journal, but as far as producing documents that are extant today, there's just not that many, and they all kind of associate with those first couple of episodes, the skirmish at Gallatin, and the events kind of after that, immediately after that. So, for example, there's an August 12th discourse of Joseph Smith at Adam-on-the-Ammon, and he's, of course, this is now after the August 6th fray, or fracas, but what's interesting is, at this point in time, he's not so concerned about what's happening up there as he's now hearing rumors that they're going to expel the Saints down in Carroll County. So Swartzel puts these words down: hold ourselves in readiness, this is Joseph Smith, at a moment's warning, well armed and equipped to go down to Carroll County and rescue Brother Hinkle. So that's about all he puts, but you can see there, at that point in time, they feel like maybe things have been resolved a little bit with the situation with the election day fracas, but now they're concerned about what might happen down in Carroll County. There's the September 5th affidavit of Joseph Smith, and this is Joseph Smith's account of the August 8th visit to Adam Black following the election day skirmish. He scoots up there with a group of men, and of course, as you probably know, there's about 100, 120, 150 that go to Black's home, and Joseph kind of stays aloof, and other of his other kind of leaders go in and talk to Black, and finally Black wants to see Joseph Smith, and Joseph comes, and as you know, he gets Black to sign this statement that he'll observe the peace in Daviess County. Well, no sooner had the Mormons left than Adam Black and William Penniston go down to Richmond and file a complaint against Joseph Smith for threat and intimidation. But anyway, this is investigated by a little bit by King, and he orders a hearing, and in preparation for that hearing, Joseph Smith makes this affidavit and gives a real good description of what went on at Adam Black's place on that occasion. So King set this date as September 5th, and Joseph writes it or dictates it on September 7th. He sets that date, and Joseph has it written down on the 5th. And David Rice Atchison agrees to defend Joseph Smith. So that's a really important affidavit for understanding what took place at Adam Black's house. And then following that hearing, there's a September 7th recognizance, and that's where King says there was sufficient evidence that Joseph Smith and Lyman White committed some sort of a wrongful act, a misdemeanor at Black's home, and issues this reconnaissance so that Joseph Smith and Lyman White will agree to appear in a session of the Daviess County Court in November. Well, by the time November rolls around, Joseph's in jail in Liberty, so that was never heard, but I guess you could say that that they observed that the recognizance by the fact that they completed their hearing in April up in Gallatin, even though it wasn't for that specific charge. Anyway, on September 8th, two men, Sterling Price and Edgar Flory from Sheridan County, came over to that hearing on September 7th. They held it just over the boundary line of Caldwell and Davies County. Joseph Smith didn't want to go into hostile Davies County, so they just held it right over the border. And these two guys come over from Sheridan County. It's quite a ways away, and to see what's going on. And they wanted to. They met with Mormon. So anyway, they were there, and then the next day they go down to Far West, and on September 8th they issue a statement that the Mormons. There was rumors the Mormons were actually planning to be in cahoots with the Indians and take over western Missouri, and they said this is not true, and so they write this affidavit. And that's another incident that we kind of sometimes overlook in the Mormon conflict there. But then on September 10th, unfortunately the day on September 9th, some Mormons intercept some men coming through from Ray County up to Davies County, and they've got 45 state arms. And they're going to the enemies up there. And so these Mormons intercept them, confiscate their arms. Word sent to Austin King, and he says, let them go and let them have a fair hearing. So those are about the only accounts that we have of the problems associated with the Mormon War. And again, you can see from really August on, Joseph Smith's main concern is the problems that are going to be that are generating now the anti-opposition forces in terms of some military kinds of conflicts. So I wish there were more on that, but that's really all there is. Have I got time to just talk about the, nope, okay. I might answer some questions about those 5 revelations, but they're really good. But that kind of covers that small first and second episodes of the Mormon Missouri conflict. So I'll turn it over to David.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Okay, well, Liberty Jail is really the heart of this volume. And I think that this is a fascinating period because we get, in contrast to this earlier period during the Mormon War, where the production of documents seems to slow down substantially, there is a little bit of evidence, though, that in October, Joseph wrote potentially 1 letter, maybe more, from Adam-on-Diamond down to the folks in Far West, telling them that they had won this great victory at Gallatin and Millport. But there is no sign of that letter after that. So, you know, if any of you are into military history, you might realize that in order to move around troops, you have to be able to communicate. So we think that there must have been more communication that happened, but that none of that survived, perhaps by design. So when Joseph is in jail, he is now writing under certain conditions that we think shape how he describes what happened in Davis County in October of that year. You have to remember that he's being charged with treason at this point in time, as well as several other crimes. And so this, Joseph knows that the guards are probably going to try to read his letters. And so there are certain places in Joseph Smith's Liberty Jail letters where we see potential clues as to how he is shaping the memory of what happened in October of 1838. One example that I'll share, and then I'll hand it off to Elizabeth, is that on December 16th of 1838, Joseph Smith writes a letter to the church in Caldwell County. And we actually have 2 versions of this letter. And there are some subtle differences between them. Now at first I wondered, okay, what's going on here? Is someone outside of the jail changing Joseph Smith's letter? But we now have evidence that that's probably not how it happened. Chances are these are 2 drafts of the same letter. And in the version that seems to be a rougher draft, there's a line where Joseph asks, he says, "Who laid waste Davis County?" And the next sentence is, "What we did was just retaliation." That sentence was excised from the other version of that letter. So if you really read carefully these letters that Joseph Smith wrote from Liberty Jail, you get little clues like that in terms of Joseph's situation in Liberty Jail, and the types of advice that he's trying to give to the saints. So I have a couple more minutes. I'll just say real quick that we have 5 letters that Joseph Smith wrote to Emma Smith while he's in the jail. And he wrote these letters in his own hand. Now this is pretty rare. If you're familiar with how Joseph Smith approaches writing, he writes hardly anything in his own hand. Now we have some evidence that Joseph saw writing in his own hand as part of his husbandly duty. That he felt that if he wrote in his own hand to Emma, that was more personal, more intimate, and this was a widespread sentiment in the 19th century. And I think it still survives to some degree today. You know, it's more personal to write a letter to a missionary in your own hand. And Joseph felt like he had to write in his own hand to Emma. So we have 5 of these letters that we reproduce in the volume. We also have three letters that Joseph writes to the church at large. And it's here that we get the sections that become D&C 121 to 123. And then there are a couple of other letters that Joseph writes, one of them to Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young, where he gives them management of the affairs of the church while the First Presidency is in jail. And the other letter is to an individual Latter-day Saint named Percindia Huntington Buell. And this is a fantastic group of letters that give us a great deal of insight into Joseph Smith's personality. This section of the volume also reproduces legal documents while Joseph is in the jail. He's petitioning for habeas corpus. He's trying to seek release. He's trying to potentially get a change of venue. And so these documents give us insight as well. Trying to escape. That doesn't show up in the legal documents, but yeah, he mentions in these letters that we dug into the wall and we were able to almost get through to the stone, but then the handle of our tool broke. So we had to whisper through the window and try to get help on the outside, and that led to them being discovered before they were able to push the granite block out of the way. This part of the volume concludes with Joseph being moved up to Gallatin in Davis County, where he is indicted and he's granted a change of venue. And it's while he's being transported down to Boone County that he and his fellow prisoners escape. And we actually have a promissory note written on the day that they escaped for $150. And we don't know exactly what that $150 was for, but we do know that $150 was the price of a good horse in Missouri at the time. And we know from other sources that Joseph and his fellow prisoners purchased a horse from their guards. And I'll conclude on this note that Hiram Smith is keeping a journal on the road. And he wrote in his journal on April 16th, he said, "We stopped for the night, but we did not stop for the night." And the next entry is they're long down the road. So he's recording how they set up camp, but he's not telling us the rest of the story about how the guards got drunk and were probably to some degree complicit in the prisoner's escape. And that sets Joseph Smith on the road to Quincy, Illinois. And that's where Brendan will pick up.
I only worked on this volume for about 5 months or so, and Mark got the war, David got jail, and then I got Quincy and Commerce. And then I passed that on to Elizabeth, and we like to joke that we got the most boring part, the least sexy and juicy part of the volume, but I will contend that there are some very pivotal things that we need to pick up out of this last portion of this set of documents that really help us to contextualize not just the movement of the saints from Missouri and eventually to what becomes Nauvoo, but the state of Joseph Smith and his associates, the precarious nature of their situation,
and also it shows us a great deal about his resolve in leading his followers. And then this comes out in a number of ways. There are, Joseph arrives on April 22nd. He spends a day or two with his family, and within about a week or a week and a half, he's in meetings. They're holding a general conference of the church. He's signing documents, and they are just right back at it, desperately trying to quickly tie up loose ends in Missouri, and loose ends still in Kirtland, and then trying to take all of their focus and establish a safe home for the saints in what's going to become Nauvoo, Illinois. Now, one of the more interesting selection of documents in this Quincy period comes after Lyman White, a close associate of Joseph, publishes a couple, op-eds, letters in the Quincy Whig, in which he goes after Democrats in Missouri, lambasts them for the poor treatment of Mormons, and just really, really digs in. Robert Thomas sees this and is quite concerned, and writes a letter to Joseph saying, this is going to cause us some serious political trouble. So Joseph then responds to Robert Thomas. He writes a letter to the editors of the Quincy Whig, which they publish in late May, explaining that Lyman White does not speak for the church, and they then publish that under the title A Difference of Opinion. He then also writes to Thompson, thanking him and kind of explaining the situation, and on May 27th he writes a letter back to Lyman White, and he doesn't, it's not necessarily an angry letter, but he explains why they had published this difference of opinion, and explains that he didn't want, and here's the phrase he used, he didn't want their, quote, the subject of our sufferings, he didn't want them to become a political question. If you know much about Quincy, one of the groups which comes to their aid is a Democratic association in Quincy, and which is an integral part of this oddly warm reception that the Saints received in Quincy, Illinois. And they are, Joseph seems cognizant of perhaps the opportunity to set these political divides aside, to have a fresh start in Illinois, and he doesn't want feathers getting ruffled before they've even been able to start establishing themselves. And so the selection of documents just, it demonstrates that precarious nature of their position in Illinois, but also shows how quickly Joseph and the Saints are pivoting from this exodus and escape from Missouri, and then immediately, once Joseph is on the ground in Illinois, they are off and running to establish the kingdom farther north in commerce. I think it's a remarkable portion of the early LDS history, and one that I think gets skipped over too much. We all talk about Missouri, and then we talk about Nauvoo. But man, there's some really important stuff that happens in this short period in between. So it's exciting. This volume really opens that up.
So as Brendan said, we now transition into Illinois and Iowa, and the Saints trying to reestablish themselves in this final section that covers April to August of 1839. And it's in early May, the 9th and the 10th of May, that Joseph, Emma, and their children move up north to Commerce, where the church had purchased land. And to kind of emphasize Brendan's point, this is less than 3 weeks after Joseph's reunited with his family in Quincy. So he just gets straight down to business and is ready to move, ready to go. And while he's there, of course, you all are probably familiar with the landscape of Commerce. This is not necessarily an idyllic situation. It's a swampy floodplain next to the Mississippi River, and it's prone to mosquitoes. The Saints will face malaria outbreaks here over the years. There's a lot of struggles that this location brings them, but of course this is also where they will build the city of Nauvoo. So as part of this, Joseph is writing to the Saints. There's quite a lot of correspondence during this period, and he's telling them to come move north with him, to come join him in Commerce. and they do so very quickly. And after these new communities in Commerce and Montrose, Iowa, are kind of hitting the ground, becoming established, Joseph then turns his attention to the 12 apostles and their planned mission abroad. This was a mission that was decreed by Revelation the previous year, and that the 12 had already kind of set in motion with a trip back to Far West in late April. So in preparation for this mission, Joseph meets with the apostles very often in June and July in 1839, and we get some really great discourses and sermons from him in kind of providing instruction and counsel for the apostles during their time abroad. And anticipating their separation from Joseph Smith, several of the apostles decide to record his 1839 sermons so that they can take these texts with them on their mission to England. And one of the most well-known records containing Joseph Smith's sermons from the summer of 1839 is Willard Richard's notebook, which is often called his pocket companion. However, Richards was not in Nauvoo at this time. He remained in England rather than returning with Heber C. Kimball and Orson Hyde, so he's not present to hear Joseph speak. And the source for these sermons that Richards recorded has been kind of a question in the kind of Mormon scholarly community. And this was after Brendan left us, so he doesn't know about this little choice tidbits of information from the Nauvoo period. But this is partly a recent acquisition from the First Presidency's vault, and partly out of research and kind of connecting the dots on our end with various discourses that are recorded. And we are able to identify what had previously been an unknown record, which serves as the source text for Richard's pocket companion. And this is a record that Wilford Woodruff kept, which he titled his Book of Revelations. And it contains the earliest known text for 3 Joseph Smith sermons given in the summer of 1839. And those are included and annotated in Documents Volume 6 for the first time. And we're really excited to get those out there. Woodruff acquired the nearly blank pocketbook after his brother's death in October 1838, but only began writing in the notebook in earnest in the summer of 1839, likely in preparation for his mission. Now, as he was leaving to go to England, he left his journal with his wife Phoebe and took this Book of Revelations with him. And it was this Book of Revelations, with the sermons and revelations that it held, that he apparently shared with his fellow apostles while in England. We have the same 2 revelations focused on the 12 apostles, D&C 112 and D&C 118, that are copied into Woodruff's Book of Revelations, Brigham Young's small journal that he kept in England, Heber C. Kimball's pocket-sized journal, and Willard Richard's pocket companion. Although we don't have a surviving notebook for John Taylor, he probably also had one at the time. While Woodruff and Taylor copied sermons Joseph gave in Nauvoo, Willard Richards was under the necessity of borrowing these notes from his fellow apostles, and the similar content, about a third of Richard's pocket companion, is copied almost verbatim from Woodruff's Book of Revelations, suggests that these men shared their notes and notebooks while in England, and also indicate the significance that the missionaries placed on these records, and that each wanted to have a personal copy of Joseph's revelations and sermons. Much like the first mission to England in 1837, the second mission involved significant sacrifice and came at a difficult time for the saints. Although the apostles had intended to leave in early July, a malaria outbreak brought illness and death and delayed their departure. Joseph Smith asked the 12, his friends, to travel to unknown lands, some of them barely well enough to stand, leaving desperately ill and impoverished families. But he did this leading by example. In conclusion to a meeting with the 12 apostles on 7 July, he advised them that they might find themselves imprisoned for the sake of the gospel, and asked them to, quote, "Remember, brethren, that if you are imprisoned, brother Joseph has been imprisoned before you. If you are placed where you can only see your brethren through the grates of a window while in irons, because of the gospel of Jesus Christ, remember that brother Joseph has been in like circumstance also." End quote. Reflecting on this meeting and the counsel Joseph offered, Woodruff wrote in his journal, quote, "May we ever realize that while we are in the service of God and doing his will, that though we may be surrounded by mobs and threatened with death, the Lord is our deliverer, and that he will support us in every time of trial and trouble." End quote. So in this volume, we really see Joseph undaunted by his imprisonment in Liberty Jail, holding the church together, indignant over the mistreatment of the saints, ready to seek redress, ready to go after kind of federal aid. He arrives in Quincy, quickly gets to business, sets things in order, and resumes leading the church. And I think it's just a really amazing volume that covers a lot of ground, and I know we're all proud to have worked on it. Thanks.
All right, well, we'll just take questions. And why don't everybody just come on up? We'll try to answer your questions if you have any.
In your Council of 50 volume, it lists about possibility about 6 more volumes, conferences, high priests minutes, elders minutes. Are there that many volumes coming out on that series?
There will be, right now we have no further plans for paper volumes for those minute books.
Okay.
But we are hoping to get all of those online, and some of them are already available online.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm just gonna say, those really should be done in paper. Really, really important church records. Okay, back here. I'll come back to you.
Sure.
So you were saying that there was a draft, you think, of his letter. Is that something that's common? Do they have other examples of that, or is that like the only one?
So Joseph wrote 3 of these general epistles, and for 2 of them we have drafts. So that seems to be the practice that they're doing, that they do a rough draft and then they make a polished draft. For the 3rd level, it appears that we have a copy. The earliest version that we have appears to be a copy, so I'm assuming that there had to have been a rough draft before that. So when we reproduce the text of these, we always point people to variants so that they can know what kind of changes were made between the drafts.
Right, if I might add, I thought what was really interesting here was that they had the draft and then they made a fair copy, but then they apparently mailed both out of the jail instead of just mailing the fair copy and then having all copies made from that. They're just kind of trying to get it out.
Right, so under normal circumstances, right, when they would try to communicate with a large number of saints, they would print something in the newspaper. They don't have a newspaper right now, so they have to just circulate as many copies as they can. In one of the letters to Emma, Joseph gives her instructions for how he wants that copying to proceed. So he says, when you've had a chance to look at it, I want you to give it to my parents, and I want a copy to be given to Edward Partridge, and on down the line. And that seems to have been followed.
One of my friends who was a bishop said when he went to BYU, his professor come running in and he had said he had just been out looking at copies of the book of Joseph from the book of Abraham. Now, are there other manuscripts, the book of Joseph and other things that weren't published that'll be
Elizabeth,
out
can
in this new volume?
Take that. We don't have any
Don't know
knowledge
about
of
that
anything
yet.
like that, and in fact,
On this time period. I mean, there's, he
so
doesn't pick
there's
out
the
the book of Abraham
Yeah.
until
Right.
1842.
yeah.
So
And the
that's-
fact, sorry, Alex.
No, that's all I was saying. I think that's
But
kind
the
of
things that are mentioned to a number of friends, he was reading from the book of Joseph and other things, but this never got in print, so maybe there are more manuscripts.
Well, that's quite possible. So there is an early document from 1835. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's 1835 that says that these papyrus scrolls that came along with the mummies that were purchased included the writings of Abraham and Joseph. Okay, and you can look at what's left of that Egyptian papyri, and you can try to guess if some of it could have been what they identified as Joseph's writings. But Joseph Smith starts working on the Book of Abraham, and as Alex just mentioned, he's still trying to work on that in 1842, and there's just no further evidence of any translation on a Book of Joseph, and in fact, they don't even finish Abraham. So it looks like there's nothing like that.
That red book that BYU did on
Yeah,
writings of Abraham and things,
Yeah.
Several, what's available that was published in there, several people mentioned that Joseph had been reading that to them, so. Something is there, but I don't know what.
he does read to people from the Book of Abraham, but not
Okay.
Joseph, not a Book of Joseph.
Okay.
Back here.
So Alex, the affidavit that Joseph makes about the incident of the black residents,
Right.
how does that fit in the context of other accounts? And
I think pretty good. In fact, there were, I was just trying to think here, it's again, been a while since I looked at it, but he gives a pretty descriptive account of what went on. And then, of course, he suggests that there was no threat or intimidation made to Black, and then Black kind of gave his own rendition of it, and he finally agreed that there was no real strong coercive effort to get him to sign.
even though there was 150 people there.
But other than that, yeah, I got to admit, if I had 150 people around my
Positive
house.
peer pressure.
So
But as
Black's,
far as
so Black's retraction comes after he files
I
the
think-
complaint in
yeah, and
Richmond.
I think King still felt like there was some problems. So obviously that was pretty threatening in the fact that there was just a big force there. But as far as actually, you know, you really need to keep the peace. You're justice of the peace up here, and he was kind of a main instigator. They felt of the anti-Mormon. In fact, he really led the charge to try to get him out earlier. And so I think that was bothering Joseph Smith almost more than the incident, just a couple of days before. But anyway, he wants him to do his civic duty, and that's keep the peace, and you have an obligation. And although maybe, you know, very, very persuasive, I don't think there was any real super threat, even though in the hearing, King said there was probable cause that, you know, there was some, I don't want to say overt activities, but that he definitely, they set a hearing date and felt like that they should respond to that, be present for it. So they had a recognizance there. So anyway.
Just in case you didn't know, Alex here is the world expert on the Mormon War in Missouri.
You're kind.
David has also done some research on the Adam Black episode. David, is there anything you want to add on that before we take more questions?
I would just add that when Black gives his version of what happened under oath, he describes how Samson Avar came in and threatened Joseph's life, threatened
Adam Black's life.
Yes, threatened Adam Black's life, threatened to drink his blood or something like that.
Drink his heart's blood.
His heart's blood.
Out of a boot. No, I'm just kidding.
But Joseph's not.
Right.
Joseph's
but then
a little
they,
more, hey, now, let's just talk this thing out.
and then they ask Adam Black,
Sounds like good cop, bad cop.
when they ask Adam Black, did Joseph Smith threaten you? Adam Black says no. The other thing that I think is worth noting.
And Joseph says, no violence was threatened in my presence.
Right.
Which is, and he comes in, Adam Black says, will you please bring Joseph Smith in?
I should say within the affidavit, he does mention that Mrs. Black was really vitriolic. I mean,
Yeah.
she just got all unglued, and I think
She was the most violent person in this
in
whole
the
encounter.
room, she really tore after him there. But anyway, it's kind of interesting. Joseph mentions that.
Yeah. The other thing that I would add is that it's actually William Peniston, who's friends with Adam Black, who files the complaint before King. And Peniston is describing what the Mormons did, and he uses the word insurrection to describe what the Mormons are doing. When when King reviews all of the evidence, he does not bind Joseph Smith over for insurrection, which was a felony, but instead for riot, which is a misdemeanor. So even King, looking at the evidence, is seeing some evidence that Peniston and Black were exaggerating.
Hyping it up.
Yeah.
Is there much documentary evidence of Mormon vigilante efforts back against the Missourians? Things actually in writing. I mean, you intimated this cryptic comment by Joseph about retribution. Is there much other in
during-
writing that you've run across?
We get some evidence at the hearing of the activities of the Mormons up there in Davies County. And they went after them. They went up there on October 18th, and they have 3 patrols that go out and go after who they perceived were the non-Mormon bad guys in Gallatin, Millport, and the Grindstone Fork region. So the Mormons was very threatening at that point. So,
But this would have been testimony that was being given by the Missourians against
Right.
Joseph, as opposed to documents from within
not so much
the faith community, or
not so much Joseph, but the whole
Right.
Mormon Danites and others up there who were taking this action. And Joseph had gone back down to far west by this time, and Lyman White took it far beyond, I think, what Joseph anticipated after that. The burnings of I can see 4 house burnings in Gallatin. There wasn't many structures. There was about 12 to 15 in Millport, and then we don't know the extent over in Grindstone Fork. So, but the Mormons carried out that kind of activity, and we had to face that fact that they'd finally, it's kind of like a dog in a fight. You put him up against a in a corner, he's eventually going to strike back. And the Mormons felt like they had the numbers, which they did, to be able to, carry out some activities there. And of course, they saw it as plunder. And
After DeWitt, though, so we're up in Davies County, and we're having a lot of trouble up there, and we ask for help from the state, and the state militia comes in and disbands the anti-Mormon forces. Okay, so law and order is restored. Then, when same thing happens in DeWitt, again, we ask for the state to help us. Again, the state sends help, and then the leader of the militia there says, actually, I'm going to take my guys and leave before they join with the anti-Mormons. And DeWitt falls and has to be evacuated by Joseph Smith. So after that point in time, the Mormons know that they cannot rely on the state to protect them, and they have to protect themselves. Meanwhile, anti-Mormons are gathering in Davies County to attack Adamanayaman, and that's when we make our preemptive strikes. I would have been there.
And just to answer your question about people writing at the time, so Albert Perry Rockwood is a Latter-day Saint living in Far West, and he keeps a fantastic journal that's describing almost daily the developments. And so he describes how the Saints are coming in from DeWitt. There are rumors that the mob is now going to go attack Adamanayaman, and so he calls it the Northern Campaign. So he is talking openly. He calls the troops, he calls them the Army of Israel. He also uses the word Danite to describe the men. And then he describes the troops coming back down, and he's very proud of the fact that it was a bloodless campaign. So he's writing down in Caldwell County. Up in Davis County, you have John Smith, who's the stake president up there, the prophet's uncle, and he's keeping a journal as well. And he wrote something to the effect of, I think it was on the 22nd of October, he said, all the enemy has been driven from the county. And that's pretty much it in terms of contemporary sources that help us out.
thank you.
So I was just wondering, is there several groups that were doing these offensive attacks on the Mormon side, or was it mainly like Samson of Ard's group? And then what evidence or what do the sources reveal about Joseph's connection? Did he approve? Did he somewhat encourage? Did he stay aloof from that? Just kind of curious.
Let's hear from Alex on that.
well, after the 18th, he comes back down to Far West, and these guys
22nd.
22nd, and they carry it out up there. I think Lyman White is kind of the main instigator up there. He's kind of the war hawk, and there's plenty of lieutenants that are going to take it to the extreme there, and and they didn't kill anybody, They just go up, tell them they got 24 hours, and leave or else. The sad part of all that, the consequences is most of these people flee into Livingston County, and the Livingston County residents say, "What's going on over there?" And they said, "Well, the Mormons have now driven us out," and this is when they make the decision to actually go after this small Mormon community at Hans Mill, and rather than just expel them, they decide to send a stronger message. Yeah, so.
This is actually kind of a reflection of those regional differences I was talking about, because in Southern culture, you attack people. In Northern culture, you attack property, like arson or vandalism or destruction. And the Mormons burn down a bunch of stuff, steal. It depends on how you look at it. You could call it war requisitions, provisions. You could call it consecrations. they did call it consecrations. So that's how the Mormons operate. You compare that to the Hans Mill massacre, and then see what happens afterwards legally. No one is ever indicted for murdering Mormons and all the other things like that. Joseph Smith and his friends are indicted for arson and treason and riot and larceny.
So what about his, or Joseph's, did he just kind of stay aloof from that? Was he somewhat supportive of
David,
that
why don't you
offensive
tackle that
attack?
one? That's a good question.
It is a good
Yeah.
question.
So, first I just want to make a quick clarification that Samson Avard is the name that usually gets thrown around here. By his own account, he was demoted from being a Danite general sometime in maybe September, so before all of this happened in October. So Samson Avard is no longer really part of the picture. He's acting as the surgeon. Joseph
Well, he's
Smith,
part of the picture because he's our scapegoat. This is really important.
he becomes the scapegoat, yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of Joseph's involvement, Joseph, by his own account, indicates that he goes up to Adamondiaman with the men who march from far west. Beyond that, he doesn't say much about what he's doing. Other people, including John Quarles, W.W. Phelps, indicate that Joseph is directing these targeted assaults on Gallatin, Millport, and elsewhere. So it really comes down to, do you find John Quarles and Phelps to be trustworthy and reliable sources or not? So it's kind of the position of the interpreter for that.
I don't know if Joseph was actually at Millport, Gallatin, or
No,
so forth.
Adamondiaman.
He's at Adamondiaman, so
Right.
he kind of separates himself from the involvement, but he's kind of aware of what's going on. We can say that. But it's not surprising then at the Richmond preliminary hearing, he's charged with overt acts of treason in Davies County. Part of that is because they burned this Jacob Stolling store, which also had the post office. And that's a federal thing. So. And Rigdon's actually charged with, I don't think Rigdon's there.
He's charged with treason
In Caldwell County.
Probably for the 4th of July.
The Trolloc speech there.
So the Wilford Woodruff Book of Revelations you talked about, it's a copy, it's in this volume, the copy's in there, in the volume?
So we have copies of, or the text of about 3 or 4 sermons that come out of that Book of Revelations. And it's also been digitized and is available through the Church History Library.
The whole book is digitized?
Yes.
And how do you access that?
If you go to the Church History Library catalog.
Online.
So is there other speeches that Joseph Smith gave that aren't recorded places that's available as well?
There will be several new ones, not in this volume, but in later volumes of the document series.
Yeah, so stay tuned. Let's take one more question. We're over time. We'll all stick around till 7:30, and we'd love to answer any questions in person.
It's just, you were saying that it was just released from the vault. Is there a process that they go through as far as releasing an item every month? A committee goes through it and says this is going to fit into your books, or how does that process work of
So
releasing things
just
from
to
the vault?
clarify, it wasn't released. So the first presidency has had a collection of items, largely ones that came over with Joseph F. Smith when he became when he moved from church historian to the prophet, and there's been, I think, continual reevaluation of those and where they belong. And it was in 2010 that this book and several others were given to the library.
Oh, okay.
So let me add one quick thing to that. Several years ago, the Joseph Smith Papers Project asked the First Presidency to let us know if they had anything that could be considered Joseph Smith Papers that we would need for a comprehensive edition. And the First Presidency really kind of has bigger fish to fry than being librarians, and they actually didn't really know what all they had. So they had an inventory made at the time, and some of our people were involved in that, and then we were able to transfer from the Office of the First Presidency to the Church History Library everything that we needed. This was kind of going along with that. So the Council of 50 Minutes, the Clayton Journals, Nauvoo Journals, yeah, the Book of Commandments and Revelations, thank you, and some other things. So thank you all for coming tonight. We really appreciate it.